I have a little bit of a baby theory for you today, both that it's a shorter theory and a little bit simpler, but also that it's about babies. For as long as I've been involved in the fandom, there has been questions about whether or not Daenerys can bear a living child, specifically because Mirri Maz Durr, when she's asked when Khal Drogo will return, lists a bunch of things that are never going to happen, and one of those things is that Daenerys' womb will quicken again and she will bear a living child. This is something that is still in Daenerys' head as she thinks back books later that if the Magi spoke truly, her dragons are the only children that she will ever have. Now, much of the discussion in the fandom has come down to the idea that perhaps what Mirri Maz Durr was saying was actually sort of a prophecy, rather than just her saying, no, he'll never come back in a creative way. There has been much speculation around the idea that maybe things like the seas going dry and the mountains blowing in the wind like leaves could happen in some other fashion. For example, the Dothraki Sea going dry, or the mountain as a character being killed, something like that. But the weird thing about looking at it this way is if this is all a big prophecy, it's leading up to the idea of Khal Drogo returning as he was before, which is, again, clearly not going to happen. It seems much more likely that, in fact, Mirri Maz Durr is just straight up saying, no, he's never coming back. The reason that she could use Daenerys having a living child as one of the examples of things that will never happen is possibly just to get Daenerys a little bit more upset, in combination with the fact that Mirri is basically the equivalent of a doctor for her people, and she has seen Daenerys have a basically half dragon child, and could potentially understand that yes, there is something dramatically wrong with Daenerys' womb that will never allow her to have children. So when you take into account the fact that Miri herself clearly didn't intend this to be a prophecy, and if she did, it wasn't a prophecy about the things that need to happen for Daenerys to have a baby again, well then it certainly seems possible that the fandom has spent much of this time distracted by this little red herring, and that basically if there is any answer to this for Daenerys, it has nothing to do with what Mirri Maz Durr said. But that doesn't mean that there's no solution. George R. R. Martin has given a very clear and obvious solution in his world building that I don't think I've really seen referenced before in regards to how it could affect Daenerys. It's something that we've talked about in many episodes on this channel in the past, and it's something that I believe might be making a resurgence in our story in the later books. I am speaking, of course, about green magic, and specifically in this case, the legend of Garth Greenhand. Because if you take a look at some of the powers that he has in legend, well, they are a direct and very obvious solution to what's going wrong with Daenerys. So, if she could ever come in contact with a green magic user, perhaps it would be possible to fix whatever's wrong with her womb. Let me read for you now directly from the legend of Garth Greenhand. Garth not only brought fertility to the land, but also to women, making barren ones fruitful with a touch, even crones who no longer got their moon blood. Maidens ripened in his presence, mothers brought forth twins or even triplets when he blessed them, and young girls flowered at his smile. Lords and common men alike offered up their virgin daughters to him wherever he went, so their crops may ripen and trees grow heavy with fruit. Any maiden he deflowered delivered strong sons or fair daughters. So that seems like a pretty open and shut case then, huh? If that is a part of legend that is in any way true, and if green magic does have this ability, then a potential user of green magic could very easily fix whatever's wrong with Daenerys. The most prominent users of green magic that we have in our story are, of course, the green men on the Isle of Faces. And they are seemingly the only ones who know the secrets of green magic that used to be practiced by people like Garth the Green, but they are secretive and kept away on their little island all to themselves. However, we do have a couple different paths for Daenerys to gain access to some of this green magic, or at least a user of green magic. Both of these come in the form of the two people who we have confirmed to have visited the Isle of Faces, Howland Reed and a dragon rider called Adam of Hull. Now, obviously, the fact that a dragon rider is one of the few people who is able to visit the Isle would make a good case that Daenerys, if she wanted to, could also visit the Isle of Faces. Normally, when you try to visit, your boat is blown away by winds or strange currents, but these defenses don't seem to hold up very well against a dragon who just swoops down and lands there. So I don't think we should necessarily rule out the idea that Daenerys herself could be one of the people who actually makes a visit to the Isle of Faces, if any of our characters do by the end of the story. The other very interesting contender for someone who could potentially help is, of course, Howland Reed, who visited the Isle of Faces just before the tourney at Harrenhal. We know that Howland Reed is probably going to come into the story at some point, and he's probably going to have some sort of important role in things, and I've speculated in previous videos on the channel that basically his role could be, on some level, to help facilitate a return of green magic to the wider world, and not just having it all locked away on the Isle of Faces. Now, it might be a bit of a stretch to say that Howland Reed suddenly would have all of the powers that were once attributed to Garth the Green simply because he visited the Green Men on the Isle of Faces. Maybe he can, or maybe he can't actually make women fertile again in the same way Garth did, and I'd be very curious to hear what you guys think of that idea, if you think that that could be a power that Howland has learned. When Mira tells Bran about all of Howland's powers, it isn't brought up, so I, again, could definitely see this going either way. Maybe Howland Reed could help, or maybe Daenerys would have to actually visit the Isle of Faces herself, and the Green Men could help. But in either case, I do think it is pretty interesting that George R. R. Martin has one of his prominent main characters having very obvious fertility issues, and potentially magically based fertility issues if they are a result of whatever happened with the blood magic that Mirri did. And he's also got an order that practices a type of magic that is specifically known to fix that exact problem. Now, in terms of how this will play out in the future books, I think Daenerys, if she were able to do it, would probably want to have children for multiple reasons. She's shown she's wanted to have children in the past with Khal Drogo, and she would obviously want to continue the Targaryen line. In the late seasons of the television show, there were talks about the fact that Daenerys couldn't have children, even though they took out the line from Mirri Maz Durr that sort of implies that she couldn't. So this was a plot point that they were sort of building up in the late seasons. And there are some rumors, and basically confirmed rumors, that they shot several scenes of season 8 with Daenerys wearing a baby bump. The interesting thing about this, in my opinion, is the fact that they shot these scenes and they were building up this plot on some level only to cut it. And given what we have for the build up towards Daenerys' fertility in the books, I think it's reasonable to suspect that this idea of Daenerys getting pregnant near the end game probably came from George, and then the reason that they cut it is just because, well, they were cutting a lot of the magic stuff that they deemed irrelevant to the actual story they were trying to tell, and Daenerys being pregnant and all of the magical implications of that were probably something that they didn't really want to go into. It would just seem a little bit odd to me if this were a D&D idea that they would have the whole idea to build up the idea of Dany getting pregnant and then just cutting it all without it ever really meaning anything. Whereas if it was an idea from something that George told them years ago and they sort of built up to it but then really didn't have anywhere that they felt they could go with it, or felt that explaining all of the magic would have been too difficult, I could see that being much more likely a reason that it was cut. So again, yeah, if it just came from the showrunners, they probably would have stuck with it. But they cut a lot of the stuff that George gave them that they really didn't feel like fit the TV show. Also, the implications of Daenerys being pregnant by Jon in the end scene where he goes all stabby stabby is definitely something that would have maybe made people even more angry about that scene. At that point, it would go even beyond what Jon had to do originally when he had to kill Daenerys because she was sort of going mad with power. It would also involve him, what's the word there, John?
He's murdering his own children. He's a monster.
That's right. Thanks, John. So, yeah, I could see why, if you weren't going to go into the blood magic details, which the show really didn't, and I think George probably will, well, I could see why in the TV show you would just cut this whole plot line and not make it even darker for the people who are really not going to understand what George has built up in his magic because D&D didn't bother to explain it. Given all of the blood sacrifice and baby sacrifice that goes on in the books, I could see George having this actually be pretty relevant. But one of the things that I'm doing here is putting out a few of these smaller theories as a little bit of preparation and giving myself a little bit of time for my bigger video where I want to talk about the endgame between Jon and Dany. So with that being said, I would love to hear any thoughts that all of you have on this. Do you think that George could potentially use green magic and the magic that he has established with Garth the Green to fix Dany's fertility issues? Do you think that that could have an effect on the relationship between Jon and Dany? And do you think that Dany will eventually get pregnant with Jon's child? How do you all see this going in the endgame of the books? Definitely let me know down in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe before you go. I'll see you with something else very soon.